12 questions. 1. Difference between inversion of control IOC and dependency injection DI. IOC, inversion of control, giving control to the container to get an instance of the object is called inversion of control. Means instead of you are creating an object using the new operator, let the container do that for you. DI, dependency injection, way of injecting properties to an object is called dependency injection. There are several basic techniques to implement inversion of control. These are: using a factory pattern, using a service locator pattern, using a dependency injection of any given below type. 1. A constructor injection. 2. A setter injection. 3. An interface injection. Or, IOC is a technique where you let someone else to create the object for you. And someone else in case of Spring is IOC container. Dependency injection is a technique where one object supplies the dependency of another object. Or, basic concept of IOC is that programmers don't need to create your objects but describe how they should be created. DI is the process of providing the dependencies of an object at runtime by using setter injection or constructor injection. It's provide implementation of IOC. Or, IOC is a design pattern based on loose coupling, and in that Spring container create the object and establish the dependencies. So, that means we don't have to create objects but have to describe how they should be created. DI is subset of IOC, or we can say implementation of inversion of control concept. So, DI is a technique where one object supplies the dependency of another object by using setter injection or constructor injection. 2. Difference between at component, at controller, at service and at repository. At component is a generic stereotype for any Spring managed component or bean. At repository is a stereotype for the persistence layer. At service is a stereotype for the service layer. At controller is a stereotype for the presentation layer, Spring MVC. Component scan only scans at component and does not look for at controller, at service and at repository in general. They are scanned because they themselves are annotated with at component. See an example. 3. Difference between Bean Factory and application context. Bean Factory is fundamental IOC container. It able to provide fundamental functionalities to the Spring applications like creating and maintaining bean objects. Application context IOC container is an extension of Bean Factory IOC container. It able to provide some advanced features like internationalization, event handling, etc. along with fundamental functionalities what Bean Factory is providing. Bean Factory is not supporting to integrate app services like security, JTA, to the Spring applications. Application context is supporting to integrate app services like security, JTA, to the Spring applications. Bean Factory is able to prepare singleton objects when we send first request for Bean, that is, lazy instantiation, initialization. Application context is able to prepare singleton objects when we activate container, that is, early instantiation, initialization. Bean Factory is supporting only the scopes like singleton and prototype. Application context is supporting almost all the Spring scopes like singleton, prototype, request, session, global session, WebSocket, etc. Bean Factory is mainly for standalone applications. Application context is for all types of Spring Framework applications. Bean Factory is an outdated container in Spring applications. Application context is not outdated container. Bean Factory has been removed completely by the Spring people from Spring 3.2. 4. What is implicit constructor injection in Spring? As of Spring 4.3, Classes with a single constructor can omit the @auto_wired annotation. A nice little bit of convenience and boilerplate removal. On top of that, also starting with 4.3, constructor-based injection can be leveraged in @configuration annotated classes. And yes, if such a class has only one constructor, the @auto_wired annotation can be omitted as well. See an example. Note, as of Spring 4.3, @auto_wired became optional on classes with a single constructor. In the above example, Spring would still inject an instance of the person class if you omitted the @auto_wired annotation. 5. Declarative transaction management internal working. See an example. Client calls the proxy which is created by Spring app, which actually start the transaction looking at the various advisors configured, and the method in the target object is invoked. After method execution, it goes back to the proxy, wherein the transaction is either committed or rollbacked. Once that is done, the control is transferred back to the client. Note, Spring creates proxies for classes that declare a transactional on the class itself or on members. The proxy is mostly invisible at runtime. 6. Difference between JAX-RS and Spring REST. JAX-RS is a specification for implementing REST web services in Java. Some of the implementations of JAX-RS are Jersey, REST-Easy, Apache CFX, Play. The Spring framework is a full framework that allows you to create Java enterprise applications. The REST capabilities are provided by the Spring MVC module, same module that provides model view controller capabilities. It is not a JAX-RS implementation and can be seen as a Spring alternative to the JAX-RS standard. See an example. Using Spring Boot and Jersey. Spring Boot provides the Spring Boot Starter Jersey module that allows you to use their JAX-RS programming model for the REST endpoints instead of Spring MVC. It works quite well with Jersey too. See Spring Annotations, JAX-RS annotations. 7. Spring Boot REST Web Service Annotation Detailed Explanation. At REST Controller, first of all, we are using Spring 4's new @REST Controller annotation. This annotation eliminates the need of annotating each method with @response body. Under the hood, @REST Controller is itself annotated with @response body, and can be considered as combination of @controller and @response body. @request body. If a method parameter is annotated with @request body, Spring will bind the incoming HTTP request body for the URL mentioned in @request mapping for that method to that parameter. While doing that, Spring will, behind the scenes, use HTTP message converters to convert the HTTP request body into domain object, deserialize request body to domain object, based on accept or content type header present in request. @response body. If a method is annotated with @response body, Spring will bind the return value to outgoing HTTP response body. While doing that, Spring will, behind the scenes, use HTTP message converters to convert the return value to HTTP response body, serialize the object to response body, based on content type present in request HTTP header. As already mentioned, in Spring 4, you may stop using this annotation. Response entity is a real deal. It represents the entire HTTP response. Good thing about it is that you can control anything that goes into it. You can specify status code, headers, and body. It comes with several constructors to carry the information you want to send in HTTP response. At path variable, this annotation indicates that a method parameter should be bound to a template variable, the one in dot. Basically, @REST controller, @request body, response entity and @path variable are all you need to know to implement a REST API in Spring. Additionally, Spring provides several support classes to help you implement something customized. Media type. Although we didn't, with that request mapping annotation, you can additionally specify the media type to be produced or consumed, using produces or consumes attributes, by that particular controller method, to further narrow down the mapping. 8. Spring Security Authentication Flow. When request came, it passes through various servlet filter and reached the authentication filter, which is username password authentication filter. This filter creates an authentication object, username password authentication token, which contains username and password. Now authentication object is used to call the authentication method in the authentication manager interface. Now request passes through various authentication provider and tries to authenticate the request. So, basically authentication provider requires user details which are available in user details service interface. Now, user details service retrieves user details and implements the user interface using supplied username. After all of this, now Spring Security created a fully authenticate object along with authenticate result, granted authority list and username, and it's stored in the security context object for future use. 9. Exception handler and controller advice in exception. Exception handler. We can define a method in controller class and use the annotation at exception handler on it. Spring configuration will detect this annotation and register the method as exception handler for argument exception class and its subclasses. See an example. Controller advice. If we want to centralize the exception handling logic to one class which is capable to handle exceptions thrown from any handler class/controller class, then we can use at controller advice annotation. By default, the methods in an @controller advice apply globally to all controllers. We can create a class and add @controller advice annotation on top. Then add @exception handler methods for each type of specific exception classes in it. Notice we extended the exception handler class with response entity exception handler. It is a convenient base class for @controller advice classes that wish to provide centralized exception handling across all @request mapping methods through @exception handler methods. See an example. Then, difference between YAML, XML, JSON and define YAML. YAML, XML, and JSON are the widely used data serialization language. All three mentioned serialization languages has the same extension as their name. YAML for YAML, JSON for JSON, XML for XML. So it is easy to remember. XML is a markup language and YAML is a markup language. YAML uses indentation to define structured data. So means each block in the YAML is differentiated by the number of white spaces. Advantage of YAML. YAML, there is no extra delimiter is used. So it is the lightweight than XML and JSON. YAML, not using delimiter also makes the reading light and simple. I'm not sure if you agree with this point. Because many geeks find it easier to read the data in content delimiter or tags separate those. YAML makes the data understanding easy. So it is useful in case of configuration. YAML has a wide variety of uses and popular for. It can be used for configuration, then from transferring data to storing intermediate data. YAML is the superset of JSON. You heard it right. Whatever valid JSON code you have, it will be parsed by YAML compiler. So choosing YAML over JSON for your project, you have one advantage. You can parse both JSON and YAML code with the single parser, YAML parser. See an example. When to use stateless and stateful. That mainly depends on whether you want to maintain the conversational state. For example, if you have a method that adds up two numbers and return the result, you use a stateless bean because it's a one-time operation. If you call this method a second time with other numbers, you are not interested in the result of the previous addition anymore. But if you want, for example, count the number of requests a client has done, you have to use a stateful bean. In this scenario, it is important to know how often the client has requested the bean method before, so you have to maintain conversational state in the bean, e.g. with a variable. If you would use a stateless bean here, the request of the client would be served each time from a different bean, what messes up your results. There are some interesting use cases. By using scope prototype, you will build a better and reliable application design architecture, for example, a real-time system. Imagine that you must build a real-time system for vehicle tracking, and you will have 2.000.000 cars sharing information every 5 seconds. In the server side, you will work with two or more distinct group of configurations, one for cars and another one for trucks. Based on this simple example, if you design your application to work with distinct configuration groups in memory through the prototype pattern, you will achieve a better performance. So, in this case, whenever the server receives a new message from a truck, for example, the server will get the instance of the configuration in memory from a hash map of instances of vehicle group configuration and then apply the configuration behavior that this message must have, e.g., like timeout, retry, and etc. 12. How to create web services as stateful. Sessions are typically an optimization to improve performance when running multiple servers. They improve performance by ensuring that a client's requests always get sent to the same server which has cached the client's data. If you only want to run a single server, you won't have to worry about sessions. There are two common approaches to solve this problem. In-memory state. If the state you want to maintain is small enough to fit into memory, and you don't mind losing it in the event of a server crash or reboot, you can save it in memory. You can create a Spring service which holds a data structure. Then you can inject that service into your controllers and change the state in your HTTP handlers. Services are singletons by default. So state stored in a service is accessible to all controllers, components, and user requests. A small pseudo example is right side. See an example. Database. The other option is to just use a database to store your state. This way you won't lose data if you crash or reboot. Spring supports the Hibernate persistence framework and you can run a database like Postgres. Note, if you are running multiple servers, you will need a more complex solution since Hibernate caches data in memory. You will have to plug Hibernate into a distributed cache to synchronize in-memory state across multiple servers. Sessions could be used as a performance optimization here. Important. Whenever you are modifying state, you need to make sure you are doing it in a thread-safe manner, otherwise your state may be incorrect. Hibernate interview questions. 2 questions. 1. Difference between persist and save and merge method in Hibernate. Save. Returns generated after saving. Its serializable return type. Saves the value to DB immediately and keeps track of the entity until the end of the session. I have tried to change the entity values outside of the transaction. It does not show any effect when session commits. Save the changes to the DB outside of the transaction. Assigns the generated id to the entity you are persisting. Session. Save for a detached object will create a new row in the table. Persist. Does not return generated id after saving. Its void return type. Saves the value to DB immediately and keeps track of the entity until the end of the session. I have tried to change the entity values outside of the transaction. It does not show any effect when session commits. Does not save the changes to the DB outside of the transaction. Assigns the generated ID to the entity you are persisting. Session. Persist for a detached object will throw persistent object exception as it is not allowed. 2. Is Hibernate's session thread safe? The session object was designed to be used by a single thread. Internally, the session uses many non-thread safe data structures, so it's impossible to make it thread safe. It depends on how you are creating a session. Session can be created in two ways in Hibernate. Get current session. Yes. It offers thread safety as it'll ensure that it'll create a session for each thread if session not exist. Transaction and automatic session closing is attached to this. Open session. It's not thread safe. Developer manually needs to manage transactions and session flush and close operations. Please subscribe our channel. We will come soon with many more interview questions. Please like video and leave your comment.